Please. And then also as a gift, as a free gift for attending, you may take one of these Germanic magazines. This is the latest issue, and they're there on the table where Janet is like Vanna White doing the product. So please take one and just not June, July. Thank you. Our other program, welcome. The other programs are June 14th, our very own Ron Fleck will be telling us about the newly dedicated James Simon Gallery in Berlin. He visited, was it December? Yeah. Thank you. We take a break in July, it's July. And then August 9th, the leader comes to the band concert at party. September 13th, presentations by IGHS scholarship winners. And October 11th, a presentation of a Indiana high school student is right now in North Rhine-Westphalia on the Congress Bundestag program. And November 8th, Jim Gould will do a presentation on the German Christmas traditions. And we'll finish the 13th at the Weihnachts Liederkranz und Christentum Austausch. Done for several years, and that will be up in Arnold, up where the Chris Gimmelmark is. And of course, we have been working with Carmen Chris Gimmelmark almost from the very beginning. Almost. Now, getting ready for the show. I'm introducing you to Michael Brown. I'm very excited about his presentation. I met Michael last September at the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Indiana Jewish Historical Society. Michael is its executive director. I was impressed with him, with the depth and breadth of his knowledge. It also is enthusiasm, because right away we had a conversation because he knew about, of course, the strong German Jewish connection of the 19th century here in Indiana. Michael comes well prepared for this with a interdisciplinary bachelor's degree in social sciences with minors in history, geography, and anthropology, with a certificate in Jewish studies. And he also has worked with Israeli startup in business development. And he also is not only a member of the Indiana Jewish Historical Society, he's executive director. He's also the board member of the Sinai Synagogue in South Bend, where he lives. And he was also the former executive director of the Hillel of Southern Illinois University. So he brings a lot of experience, but also insight. He has deep insight into these different topics. And so I very happily recruited him to speak because he's going to give me a new perspective on Indiana Jewish heritage. Michael Brown.
Thank you so much for Herzlich willkommen, and thank you for having me here today. It's a real pleasure and honor to be here and join you here today. And I don't know where the echoing is coming from, but
You have an extra set of speakers
what's going
that
on?
can't be detected.
But first of all, what I would like to say is that I wanted to dispel a couple of different myths that are even common in the Jewish community about the origins of German-speaking Jews and where they came from. So the first myth I'd like to dispel from this lecture was the myth that Jews from German-speaking lands were only urban. This makes sense because we think of, the major centers like Frankfurt and Berlin as having large Jewish courts. This is true in the 20th century, but in the 19th century, it wasn't unheard of or unconscionable to run into a small Jewish community in rural parts of Central Europe, rural parts of German-speaking lands. This wasn't unheard of. So many, many small towns have one or two different Jewish families in them. This wasn't unusual at all. But 50 years ago, when the Indiana Jewish Historical Society was founded, and American Jews who thought of German-speaking Jews as being very urbane and sophisticated and cosmopolitan and city-dwelling, thought, wow, there are Jews living in small towns like Ligonier, Indiana. This is just such a strange, weird phenomenon. It's like they landed on Mars. But if they had studied 19th century German history a little bit more closely, they'd understand that this wasn't uncommon at all. It was actually quite common for Jews to live in small rural areas. And so Jews coming to rural areas in the 19th century in Indiana wouldn't be abnormal or strange. And the people encountering them, the German speakers who also came from were Jewish, wouldn't also think that was strange. So they wouldn't say, wow, you're some foreign alien who's coming here. They were very used to Jewish merchants, Jewish peddlers going through their own small towns in the German-speaking parts of Central Europe. So these are just a couple of things I wanted to spell first. Some misconceptions that are even really common in the Jewish community. But if you understand 19th century German-speaking history, it makes more sense why Jews want to live in rural areas, even in Indiana, as well as parts of what would become Germany. So I'll jump in now into my lecture called Indiana Israelitism. Now, please forgive me, my German is terrible, okay? But I'll try my best. So we're looking at from the years 1848 to 1890. And I guess a few of you probably already know why I'm going to year 1848, but we'll get to that in a second. So first of all, what is a German Jew, or what is a German-speaking Jew? What are they? What makes a German-speaking Jew a German-speaking Jew? Or how do we define it? So what we mean by Germanic Jews are Jews who are Ashkenazi, Ashkenazi is the biblical name of Ashkenaz, true word for Germania. Why do they believe to be descended from slaves who were captured, Jewish combatants who were taken to the out to the barbarian parts of the Roman Empire and dumped off by the Rhine. Some theorize Ashkenazi are genetically traced to 4 women who lived on the Rhine several thousand years ago. That's where we trace our beginnings, our genesis. Relentlessly murdered by the Crusaders. This can still be found in Ashkenazi liturgy. And by Germanic Jews or German-speaking Jews, we mean Jews primarily speaking German as their first language. This becomes more common after the Enlightenment. And so, what are some of the key features of German-speaking Jews? So, German-speaking Jews really enjoy synagogue choirs, similar to choral music that you would find in Germany. And this was even true in smaller Jewish communities. Even in Indiana, there was a real love of choral music. Now, dividing into different periods of Jewish immigration to America and to Indiana, we start out breaking it into, this is a little bit disagreed upon by different historians, but basically the first wave of Jewish migration to America were the Sephardic Jews who came from Recife, Brazil, to Amsterdam. And then this first start of the significant German-speaking Jewish immigration started in the 1840s, really ended by the 1880s. Sorry, I put one extra 8 in there. And the period we're dealing with in this presentation is more or less that period running between the 1840s to 1880s/1890s. The last, most prominent phase of American Jewish immigration started in the 1880s to the 1920s, comprised mainly of Jews from Yiddish-speaking backgrounds and a smaller minority of Ladino-speaking immigrants. Now, people think of Yiddish as being kind of a bad German. It's not. It's its own language. It's related to German. It's descended from German, but it's its own language. And so when we're talking about Yiddish speakers who come later, there are people who move further to the east, but they're not German speakers, and they would come in a later phase of American Jewish migration, which would be the largest phase. So what we're really talking about is middle phase of Jewish migration to America, the Germanic phase, as it's known to American historians. So the normality of being rural, like I was saying earlier, it was completely normal to live in a rural community and live amongst non-Jewish neighbors. This wasn't something abnormal, and this trend would continue well into the 19th century. And you can see this play out, Jews moving from small areas, German-speaking areas, to towns like Madison, Indiana, Wabash, or in here, as we'll find out later. And that, if you're wondering, is the synagogue at Erfurt in Eastern Germany. So diving in a little bit. So
Interrupt you for just a second. Sorry, somebody from ML started sharing on Twitter. Saying,
so I'll just continue talking about the terms. So why do we say Germanic or German speaking rather than German or Germany? So the reason why I do that is that throughout much of this presentation, we're not dealing with a country of Germany that exists yet until the 1880s. So we're dealing with what would become Germany, places like Saxony, places like Bavaria, different principalities and parts of Germany that would become Germany in the 1880s. So it's really incorrect to call them Germans at that point. As you probably know, they were very proud of different regions they came from, and Jews were as well. So each region of Jews also had their own separate customs, just like non-Jewish Germans had their own customs per region, and their own differences and their own diversity. So it's really kind of not accurate to call them German yet. That's why people say German speakers or Germanic instead of calling them German, if you're wondering. Here is a group of Jewish hymns called Zero in Hebrew by an educator named Simon Axe in Evansville, Indiana. And you'll see a keen focus on choral music again, which is really a Germanic influence on the Jewish liturgy. And what I'm focusing today on is the congregational side of Jewish life. So that part of the synagogue we'll be focusing on today. So what are the three major movements of American Jewish life? Well, they all have origins in Germany, and what would become Germany. So all of them started essentially with the German Enlightenment of the mid-19th century, called the Haskalah in Hebrew, with the philosopher Moses Mendelssohn. And Moses Mendelssohn, who translated the Bible into German, remained himself an Orthodox Jew. If you're wondering, one of his relatives was the great composer Felix Mendelssohn. Looking at this, we can see that really the different movements of American Jewish life have their origins in German-speaking facts. Whether it's modern American Orthodoxy, the conservative movement of Judaism, which is the middle movement, or Reformed Judaism in America, which is the more liberal movement. So they all have their origins in the German. world. But one interesting thing is that when we think of Jews coming to America, coming to the frontier, to the pioneer places, we think of most of these Jews as being reformed or less religious. This is actually a misconception. Many of the Jews who were coming were actually Orthodox, came from Orthodox background, kept kosher, had kosher slaughter, created bathhouses for women during the menstrual cycle, and maintained most of the biblical prohibitions. So what we have here is an advertisement to Achtu Fishalom, which is the first Jewish congregation in Indiana, in Fort Wayne. And it's from 1848, which, believe it or not, was actually the same year as the first synagogue being formed in Brooklyn, New York. Just to put this into perspective, how old this event is. And the ad is asking for a person that can perform three things in Hebrew. And the first thing is moil, which is a ritual circumciser. The second part is a shochet. And the last part is chazan. Now, a shochet is a kosher slaughterer. A chazan is a cantor, like a person with a wonderful voice who can sing. So they want someone who knows German and the Hebrew language and can teach in this language and works at $400 per annum. Well, they're asking a lot, aren't they? But it tells you something about this community, that this is a very traditional community, and that's still very Orthodox. That was found in 1848. And not the idea of a Reformed community that tried to dispel ideas of the dietary laws or the older style of Jewish musical motifs, or even circumcision later on, and radical reform. So why did the German-speaking Jews come to the Midwest in Indiana? Well, basically for the same reasons that their non-Jewish contemporaries came to the Midwest. And that's one of the big differences between the later migrations of Jews and this migration of Jews, is that they came in a wave of Catholics and Protestants together, rather than fleeing from people as a separate group, as their Yiddish-speaking contemporaries would come later to America. So there were push factors and pull factors. So there were push factors such as anti-Semitic laws in places like Bavaria regarding professions and marriage licenses, that put a cap on how many people could get married and what kind of professions they could work in. And if you're wondering why so many Jews worked in certain industries, it's because in Bavaria, they kind of stipulated what professions you could work in. And then pull factors such as economic opportunity or the possibility of entrepreneurship. So they heard from someone else, wow, there's this great opportunity on the Erie River. You got to come down here. It's just like gold, everything turns to gold here. And then in 1840, to put it in perspective, only 15,000 Jews lived in America. By 1860, at the beginning of the Civil War, that number grew to 150,000. So many like-minded, progressive, non-Jewish German speakers were also fanning out all over the Midwest during the same time. So you imagine this mosaic of Catholics, Protestants, and Jews that was around in Enlightenment Europe, Enlightenment Central Europe. And many of the people who came here, many of your forebears also believed in that, this idea of a mosaic, of a synagogue, a Catholic church and a Protestant church all being aligned next to each other. You've probably seen pictures like that from the 19th century. So, back to this year, 1848. So this is really the capstone year. It changed everything for everyone here. So this is probably why many of your relatives or forebears came to America, and this is why some of the earliest Jewish families came to America was the year 1848. So Enlightenment sort of came to, not to a complete halt, but kind of a thump. The revolutions failed, and the old order of inequality and serfdom kind of continued because the Russians interfered in the revolutions. And this wasn't just Jews who were involved in revolutions. It was also Protestants, it was also Catholics. It was just basically anyone who wanted the old order to change and have true enlightenment Europe and to do away with a lot of inequality that existed in European life in the 19th century. So when those revolutions failed, and they happened all over Europe, but more precisely, I think it had a bigger effect in the German-speaking part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and what would become Germany. That pushed many people to want to come to America. And that's where you get the free thinkers, and you get many other great movements that come to America and inspire a lot of American life. So who were some of the different groups of German-speaking Jews who settled in Indiana? Each had its own traditions and ritualistic customs. So just like German speakers were a monolith, neither were German-speaking Jews. So you had Bavarians, Alsatian Jews, Swabian Jews, Prussians, Bohemians, Austrians, and Poseners. And each one of these groups had their own Jewish customs, their own prayer melodies, and their own way of But when all these groups came together, imagine taking all these different groups, and I can imagine this also in a Protestant or Catholic church. You take all these different traditions and you kind of put them all together in one place. It seems pretty crazy. I'm sure it was pretty hectic trying to manage, like, okay, what prayer traditions do we use here? You know, what prayer book do we use? Do we pick up? How do we settle these debates? And I'm sure this was very similar debates in the boards of Protestant churches and Catholic churches as well. So a major factor when a Jewish community was formed in Indiana was the mode of transportation. So the earliest Jewish communities in Indiana tended to spring up along rivers in the 1840s. So places like Fort Wayne, Evansville, Lafayette, Madison. And then later in the 1850s, one decade later, they started to spring up by the river. Places like here in Indianapolis, Ligonier, LaPorte, and Marion. So you can see the first phase is really along the river, and the next phase is along the rail. And so we're going to start looking at what were the kind of professions that were bringing them to come to Indiana. So a lot of Jews work in the garment industry, and this was mostly in part of because of the limitations on the number of professions that Jews could actually hold in Europe. They tended to gravitate back to those professions, and other European immigrants trusted them in this profession. So in other words, they trusted them in the garment trade. They knew that they would get a fair price. They knew that they were fair vendors. They knew that they were fair merchants. So Jews sort of replicated the same kind of like they had in Europe, but gained a lot more success from it because there were fewer restrictions. So here you have a Sol Myers company in Ligonier, Indiana, a great story of a peddler family that grew from peddling into creating dry goods stores, into banking and finance, and so this story kind of replicates this. This is kind of a boilerplate. You have these, you know, they did it, the Indiana Historical Society, this Jewish merchants of Indianapolis. But this is basically a boilerplate you find in most Indiana towns and cities all over the state. Whether we're looking at Hammond, or whether we're looking at South Bend, or whether we're looking at Marion, or Muncie, or Terre Haute. Each one of them had this retail district of department stores, dry goods stores that were owned by Jewish families from German-speaking backgrounds. This is so common throughout the entire state, going all the way down to Vincennes, down to many of us are probably familiar with the Gimbel family legend, right? So, so this was very, very common. But this gives you the kind of profession, an idea of the professions that were the pull factor that was creating these communities that would become congregations. So we reach a point where we find a person that basically is the center of our story, and he is the main antagonist. And you can't understand 19th century Jewish history in America while understanding Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, who was quite a character. He was Bohemian, he was from Bohemia, And he was kind of like the Zuckerberg of his generation. He had several newspapers, the Deborah and the American Israelite. And although he wasn't formally, he didn't formally receive his rabbinical degree, he sort of became the rabbi of the communities he worked in. So first he went to Albany, New York, and got into a huge fight there. He didn't feel that they were innovative enough to be part of a frontier society that he saw America going to. So he went to Cincinnati, and he saw that Cincinnati was the future of American Jewish life and the future of America. And so he decided to create an American Judaism called Minhag America, or the Traditions of America, where he would take all these different prayer books that were floating around, all these different traditions, and he'd say, no, we're going to have one prayer book, we're going to have one tradition, we're going to have one movement, and they're all going to be under me. And so he proceeded to put all of that together. And he used his newspapers, the Deborah in German and the American Israelite in English, to basically start attacking all of his opponents, to consolidate all of them. So whether they were the traditionalists to his right, like Isaac Leeser, who we'll get to him in a second, who had his own newspaper, or those to his left, the more radical reformers who he equally disliked. But he had this grand vision of opening up synagogues all over the frontier. Wherever he saw a Jewish community, he was going to talk them into starting a synagogue and using his prayer book and joining his movement. And you'll see that this eventually leads to him creating the first rabbinical school in America that has its origins here in Indiana, believe it or not. So who are these fine gentlemen here? These are the Nerd leaders, and they're the founders of Indiana's first synagogue. And again, I apologize, my schlechte Deutsch. Heckengen was where they were from before they moved to Philadelphia and then to Fort Wayne. They owned a large store there. You'll see this is almost boilerplate. Many of them owned dry goods stores after working as peddlers for a number of years. And they were the founders of a militia organization known as the Keokea Guards. And if you recognize that name from somewhere, it's like the baseball team, right? It's from Fort Wayne, the first Major League Baseball team. Well, that was his son who owned a baseball bat factory, who started one of the first Major League Baseball teams in Fort Wayne. So that's a fun fact about the Nerdlingers. So we'll go to the next slide here. So in Fort Wayne, the congregation Active for Shalom worked as a Gemeinde, as like a mutual aid society, much like a Catholic church. So you can see that there are different parts from birth to death that they are a complete community that you're joining. So you're not just joining a synagogue, you're joining your health insurance, your medical aid, your education, your school, your funeral, your moil, everything. It's from beginning to end of your life. They're a full community. They're a Gemeinde, just like the Catholic Church is for Catholics, essentially. And this is the Nerdlinger home. Now, I found several different sources for this, and I haven't found anything to discount this, but the legend has it, and I haven't found a primary source to actually support this, but I found a lot of secondary sources that claim that this was a station on the Underground Railroad. But there's no primary sources to actually prove that their home was part of the Underground Railroad. But that's a legend that exists in Portland lore. And it started with 23 members on Main and Harrison Streets. And by the way, the Indiana Jewish Historical Society did not start in Fort Wayne because the first synagogue was in Fort Wayne. No connection. Seriously, absolutely no connection. That's a different story for another day. So Deborah, back to Deborah, the German newspaper of our good friend Rabbi Isaac Mayer, Dr. Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise. And he's discussing this synagogue opening up, and that was originally a German Methodist church that was purchased on Harrison Street. This is actually their first building in 1849 after they moved out of their neighbor's home in 1848. And so we have the other newspaper on the opposing side from Isaac Mayer Wise, the Occident by Isaac Leeser. And the Occident is his bitter enemy. And they invite the Occident to come to Fort Wayne. So you have to be sure that Isaac Mayer Wise is steaming and angry and mad. It's like, how dare they invite Isaac Leeser to come from Philadelphia? I'm here in Philadelphia. What am I, chopped liver? So obviously he's angry about it. He writes about it in the American Israelite. But this synagogue, it employs their first rabbi, and the fact that they went by the title Reverend because they weren't officially rabbis. And he taught a parochial school because they didn't have schools yet. So there was actually a German English-speaking school that they attended to as their main school. It wasn't just a Sunday school. And here's the article from the Occident about Isaac Leeser going there. And let's get ahead a little bit here, because this is basically about the Occident complaining that they're starting to become a little bit closer to Isaac Mayer Wise's position. They're starting to adapt a lot of his ideas and become more and more reform as he's influencing them, and away from their traditional orthodoxy. So this is something I'd like to point out is just for the architects here, is just the Gothic design of the third synagogue that Fort Wayne developed through Octave Shalom, and the kind of architecture of Firth where they adapted their traditions from. So Firth was actually the first place that they adapted their prayer book from and the traditions of that Jewish community. So you see this kind of Gothic style that kind of fits their sort of their traditions in Firth. And here's another picture of a frontal view of their third synagogue in Fort Wayne from 1876. And personally, I think this is the most beautiful synagogue I've seen in Indiana. This is my personal favorite. Maybe you'll see some others that you think are even more beautiful, but here's another shot from 1876. And then we'll go to this beautiful synagogue here, which is arguably the synagogue that has the most Germanic-like characteristics in Lafayette, Indiana, which is actually the second Jewish community started in Indiana. So you have what happens in many different Jewish communities, this also happened in Fort Wayne, is that when someone dies and there is a burial committee that needs to be formed, that is the moment that the congregation actually forms. It's not that case in every community. I'm losing my battery here. It's not that case in every community that it starts out as a burial committee. But many Jewish communities from German-speaking lands, they started out as burial communities. So you'll see an exception here. Like, are they going that? So this is in 1849. This is 1 year later, after Octave Shalom was founded. And what's interesting about this is that you can see the synagogue that they built. And then if I go I'll go one slide down, you can see it basically has its own sister synagogue and Laufsweier, Germany, that was built in 1910, that are both built, and please forgive me on my terrible pronunciation, in the Rundbogenstiel round arm style. So you see that the wonderful comparison of these two synagogues. And by the way, Achim, which was known as Temple of Israel later, is actually still the oldest purposely built synagogue left. There's only two 19th century synagogues left in Indiana. that we have, and Ligonier from the 1880s, and this wonderful example of 1867. So in wonderful Hoosier style, the first synagogue that existed before this temple was built was actually a prayer hall that was on top of a gun shop. So I just wanted you to hear about that one, because I think that's a wonderful story. So here, Evansville's next synagogue is built. So this is really the third synagogue built in Indiana. The Washington Street Temple, B'nai Israel, was founded in 1853, and the Gumperts, who arrived from Rossweiler and Rheinland-Pfalz, were the first known Jewish family to permanently settle in Indiana, and they donated the land to the synagogue. So the way that this Jewish community started was, it wasn't started as a burial committee like the Jewish community in Lafayette or in Fort Wayne. It was actually just a regular prayer corps. And we'll go down here to D. Deborah, and we can go back to the moment that he sees the synagogue form. We see that Isaac Mayer Wise is there. He's, why aren't you using my prayer book? He's like, this is a wonderful synagogue you built, but you're not using my prayer book. I'm so disappointed in you. And then here is Rabbi Max Delbanco, who is just a fascinating person because he's sort of a Jewish political football who has the most tragic ending. So even though his family came from Italian Jewish origins, he actually grew up in Hamburg. The Delbancos were a prominent family of Sephardic origins that lived in Hamburg, Germany. He was a person that was always too hot or too cold. So one community would think he was too Orthodox, another one would think he was too Reform, and the different newspapers would go back behind his back in two different Jewish communities here in Indiana and LaPorte in Evansville. And he would constantly have to battle all these rumors in these newspapers. His own secretary was writing nasty things about him. And he ended up deciding he didn't want to be a pulpit rabbi. He actually volunteered to go down to Vicksburg in the Civil War and ended up dying in a steamboat explosion late in the Civil War. So it's a very tragic end to Rabbi Max Delbanco. So looking at Evansville, we have this abstract that talks about how a Christian German-speaking choir master would perform in the Protestant church and the Catholic church and the temple at different points in the week, and do it seamlessly. So you have an idea of how integrated these communities were. Again, this idea of kind of a mosaic again from the mid-European Enlightenment. And so what's really special at Evansville is that their Washington Avenue temple actually listened to Isaac Mayer Wise and became the first official synagogue to join his movement in 1873, which was a really big deal because this was going to be the biggest Jewish movement that ever been formed in America and America's history. And so in 1875, the Hebrew Union College was founded. What the Hebrew Union College was the first American rabbinical school. So many of the people who called themselves rabbis were not actually rabbis, including Isaac Mayer Wise himself, which had dubious ways of getting their own rabbinical degrees. And he wanted to actually streamline this process and actually create a legitimate rabbinical school in Cincinnati. So he went around to a lot of donors. They all said, "You're nuts. This is never going to work. Forget about it." Except for one Orthodox Jewish merchant from Lawrenceburg, Indiana, who he's friends with, who was born in Alsace-Lorraine, named Henry Adler, who invested $10,000. So he was a middle-class dry goods store owner who forked over a huge part of his almost all the savings to start this rabbinical school, even though he didn't belong to this temple. And so the letter is actually still there between Adler and Wise, and this rabbinical school would become the fountain of American Jewish leadership for generations to come, even into the present day. So if it wasn't for a dry goods owner from Alsace-Lorraine named Henry Adler, there would be no rabbinical school in Cincinnati. And this is really a changing point in American Jewish life. So going down one slide. So this is actually the first rabbi that graduated from that class at Hebrew College. And his name is Israel Aaron. And he would go to Congregation Shalom starting in 1883. And this is a huge deal because he's the first rabbi ever in American history who actually gained a pulpit and became a rabbi in America. And now we're going to go a little bit further south because we haven't covered, I feel like, some of the Jewish communities in southern Indiana enough. So one of the earlier Jewish communities, going back a little bit to the 1840s, is Madison, Indiana, formerly Indiana's biggest city, Porkopolis, which is an odd place for a Jewish community. If you think about Porkopolis, you think that wouldn't be attractive, right? So what we have here is the W.H. Hofstede Low building that actually contained the first ritual bathhouse that was in its basement. I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. And inside of it actually had a congregation from the 1850s. And there were 50 Jewish families living in the town. So the first Jewish congregation, if you remember back, the Achim Shalom had 23 members. This community actually had 50 members, which was bigger. Just to put it in context. So here's a picture just to give you the dimensions of how tall this door was of the synagogue. And outside, you can see the leading into the basement, which was the bathhouse. They also had a kind of like a smokehouse for kosher slaughter as well, and goblets, but no pork. So this man, this person has a very impressive beard here. Is Gottfried Wehley. He was the 1850 leader of the Madison Jewish community. He was a merchant trading cigars. But what's really remarkable about this person, most of the other people that were in the community, the 50 members, were people from poor Jewish backgrounds. He actually came from a very wealthy family, almost aristocracy, I will say. And he was actually descended from the founder of conservative Judaism, Zechariah Frankel. And then he became the president of the synagogue, became the balance, help all these different diverse groups and socioeconomic groups to get along together. And so his great uncle was Justice Louis Dembritz Brandeis, the first Jewish Supreme Court justice, who would be born in Louisville. And what's really, really odd and strange about Bailey was that he gave a last will and testimony in German, bemoaning the fact that his family was no longer following the tenets of Sabbatianism, which was believing that Shabbatai Tzvi was the Messiah. This was so strange, this is so odd and so weird. When I read this, I had to reread it like 4 or 5 times, because this is something that happened in the Middle Ages, where there was a false Messiah that tried to get everyone to go to the Holy Land. And he failed, he converted to Islam, and he disappeared. But there were a few people who continued to believe that Shabbatai Tzvi was the Messiah, and including this family, which was one of the last families in the world, apparently, and the only family in America that believed that Shabbatai Tzvi was the Messiah. So there you go. Madison, Indiana. In the 15th century. So this is Rabbi Bernhard Felsenthal, who was a really remarkable rabbi who came to Madison, Indiana. Actually, originally he came to teach the Adler's children in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. He actually was a rabbi. He became a rabbi in Germany. He was quite learned, and he helped publish a prayer book that became the competition for wisest in America. So you can imagine right off the bat, he was not friendly with Isaac Mayer Wise at all, and he was sort of the liberal antagonist to Isaac Mayer Wise. They had a real beef. And later he became one of the founders of Reformed Judaism in Chicago, and he was also a ardent abolitionist, which, being right on the border of the 1850s, divided the congregation immediately, because some said, this isn't our fight, others said, yeah, like we should fight slavery for everything we got. So immediately he had just come just as he was leaving and going to New York. And so he was no longer there to keep the congregation together. And that was really the beginning of splinter in the Jewish community of Madison. But Felsenthal went on to a very long, stellar career in Chicago, and really was the founder of Reformed Judaism in Chicago. After his 6 years of trauma and drama in Madison, Indiana. And he was also the founder of the American Jewish Historical Society. So this is actually, this would become Adath, or Adath's Israel Congregation in Madison, Indiana, in 1868. This is actually, I can't remember what they, I think it was a firehouse or something that came later on. No, I think it might be torn down now. Here's a picture of Isaac Mayer Wise, and I wanted to include this because people think, like, why would people think that Isaac Mayer Wise was such an attractive character? Okay, why would they see him? But he used flowery language like this. What a handsome place is Indianapolis, the city, a capital, the center of an extensive and fertile plain. Yet every house is a fine country seat, and every person has a smile on their face. Had old Jupiter known the capital Indiana, I'm not sure he would have selected Olympus as his residence. Isaac Mayer Wise. So you can see he would go there, he would sell them, he had a way about it. And this is his Minhag America, if you're wondering what it looked like the cover of it. And so this is really, we're getting to Indianapolis now, and this is actually a part of Deborah that I found that talks about, we were just discussing, when a Jewish community is really formed is when someone dies and they have to form a burial committee, and this is really the beginnings of it right here. This article from 1856 of Deborah, where Mr. Wolf of the head of the association decides to form after that. And so the first synagogue, or the first place of prayer in Indianapolis, formed in Judah Block in Indianapolis, right across from the courthouse. And Judah Block was used because this was actually the son of Samuel Judah, who was an early Jewish community member, and he was an early politician in Indiana life. He was actually the first and only Jewish Speaker of the House of Representatives here in Indiana in 1850. So his son was not Jewish, his children were not Jewish, their mother wasn't Jewish, they weren't raised Jewish, but his son felt that he should allow them to pray on his property. So that was important. So going down a little bit we'll skip ahead a little bit from Judah Wexler, who is sort of a very loyal Isaac Mayer Wise early on. And then we'll go past Rabbi Wexler right into Rabbi Meir Hessig, is such an interesting character himself. So he was a veteran of the Franco-Prussian War, and he was wounded, and he found a copy of Deborah, and it was for a rabbi in Indianapolis. And he looked at it and he said, you know what, I'm going to do this. So he took the newspaper, came to Indianapolis, said, I'm interviewing for this job. hello, I'm Rabbi Meir Messing from a long line of, 14 generations of rabbis. All my brothers are rabbis, and everyone I know is a rabbi. And they're like, wow, it's amazing that you're hired. So he basically became the first celebrity rabbi of Indiana, doing hundreds and hundreds of weddings, and he founded Name Society in Indianapolis. He was really, really important in the philanthropic field and interfaith relations here. And I have some pictures of Rabbi Meir Messing and the first synagogue that was built during his time here. And Senator Morton he was formerly Governor Morton, but then Senator Morton in 1868 was at the opening. So was General Friedrich Niesler, the famous Jewish general from Indianapolis. So you have this colossal building, which I know William did amazing work helping to put a historical marker there for the first synagogue in Indianapolis. So we'll go ahead, we'll skip a little bit ahead. We already talked about Rabbi Meir Messing. So that synagogue grew so quickly because he was just a dynamo. Tons and tons of people were joining his temple, and some of these names you might even recognize, certainly the history of this institution here at the Athenaeum at the Das Deutsche House, because they were also members and founders of the Das Deutsche House, who were also on the board at the Indianapolis Hebrew Congregation. And they were highly integrated in the community, highly respected figures. And then we see this picture from 1899 that is such a strange figure in Jewish life. We have Moses with horns here, which is kind of strange in Jewish life because it was translated not as horns, but actually as rays of light. That's why people ask, Jews, do you have horns in your head? But you can see an example of a beautiful organ that was inside of Indianapolis Hebrew Congregation in 1899, and outside view of the beautiful temple there. So we have, and by the way, that stained glass window is still in Indianapolis Hebrew Congregation. They still have it this very day. I'll go a little bit north now. I'll go to LaPorte, Indiana, really quickly. So there was a famous rabbi maker by the name of we'll go through this for a second here. Well, he wrote Olaf Tamid. They took on Olaf Tamid and fought off North America up there. And so this drew obviously a lot of pushback against LaPorte, and LaPorte eventually also adopted North America without. But first there was a big, huge struggle there. And this is Jacob Weil. Now, Jacob Weil, who was the Baker rabbi, also had a brother named Simon Weil, who was an early Jewish senator in the State House, who passed an important early law for child protection acts. But what he was really known for was that he was very, very close to Notre Dame. And he actually helped Notre Dame secure some key loans when other Protestant founding banks would not loan to Notre Dame. So Notre Dame was really, really appreciated his help. So looking at this is actually the synagogue in LaPorte, Indiana, that lasted into the late 1890s. And so they said, in all that we plan, we have the neatest little temple west of the Allegheny Mountains, which is not saying too much, if you will, consider that it has been built by a congregation of 20 members. So we'll go there. You can see other Jewish communities in Wabash, Indiana. I'll go through. I just want to cover this gentleman right here, Rabbi David Phillipson. So he was born in Wabash, Indiana. But the reason why he's important is that he's really the heir to Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise's throne. And many people don't realize that he was born here in Indiana, in Wabash. And he was actually present some of the important things that happened to negotiate this tension between the radical reformers he would actually develop the Pittsburgh platform to bring them all on board as Eastern European Yiddish-speaking Jews started to arrive. So he was really, really important in doing that, and really famous for the Pittsburgh platform. This is actually a synagogue that was found in Columbus, Indiana, from 1871 to 1887. And apparently this was a purposely built synagogue, but it looks like a house repaired from the way it was reconstructed in Columbus, Indiana. It was that had a period of growth. And you can see like storefront synagogues, for example, in places like Peru, Indiana. Peru, Indiana actually sprung up the early small Jewish community founded by German speakers. And you have a picture of Bill Krause, who's actually the only Jewish member of Congress from Indiana. And he was actually defeated by the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1920s. Both of his parents came up from German-speaking backgrounds. And his brother, his younger brother, was actually a rear admiral who helped develop the predecessor, one of the predecessors of NASA. So Peru, Indiana, just a little bit more about their first synagogue. I'll go through here. Here's a picture from Ligonier, Indiana, the family you can see here. And going through, you can see how much the Methodist Church in Ligonier looks like a Havath Shalom that's built later in the 1880s in Ligonier, Indiana. You can still see it's actually a private residence, but it's still standing there. It's well taken care of. And the Jewish population of Ligonier peaked at 200. But as much as you hear about Ligonier, you think that there were like 2,000 there, but it was never any bigger than 200 Jewish members. And here's a wonderful stained glass window that you can find. Back then, it was a little more rare to find pictures of human beings depicted in stained glass windows. But if you look around in places like Terre Haute and Ligonier, actually wasn't so uncommon. And you saw Moses earlier. So King David on his throne, for example. And now we'll get to Terre Haute. So actually, their first synagogue, just like we saw the mold of Fort Wayne moving into a former German-speaking church, they've actually moved into a Lutheran church as their first synagogue in the 1890s. Pictured here, you can see Philip Schloss, who was also a early Jewish state senator and a Civil War veteran. He was one of the synagogue's leaders, and you can see Rabbi Alexander Lyons. They're one of their earlier rabbis. And this is just some honorable mention. Some smaller Jewish communities have also had small synagogues, Logansport, that I don't have any pictures or not a lot of documents, but I know they existed because the Reform movement listed them as member synagogues. Mount Vernon, I know someone came from Posey County here, Attica, Kokomo, and Muncie. So yeah, so now I'm open to questions. I'm open to questions, but I just wanted to really quickly summarize. So what did we get from this? We got that basically the reason why synagogues expanded in Indiana were economic push and pull factors, and Isaac Weierweiss's sheer tenacity and chutzpah. So I'll leave it at that. So if anybody has questions, please ask. I'm all open. Yes.
If you had to, I have never been inside of a synagogue. If you had to describe you showed us pictures that look very different from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
What do they have in common on the inside? Like Christian church is in the form of the cross, the altar faces east and so on. There are certain characteristics that even the most modest church try to maintain.
Right, that there are certain standards in the synagogue. So there are the different traditions. In fact, for example, the lectern where it stands, there are certain traditions. So in Germany, in what would become Germany, they were highly influenced by Sephardic Jews from Spain. So their aesthetics, they would borrow different parts of that. So for example, the lectern being in the middle of the synagogue, in some German-speaking synagogues was a norm. or aesthetic Sephardic style, kind of Middle Eastern, even Neo-Moorish style aesthetic inside of synagogues, borrowing from Spain, being a place of the Enlightenment, trying to seem like they're part of the Enlightenment was very important to them. The main important part of the synagogue is that it faces east towards Jerusalem. It has typically in the center, it has an ark that holds the Torahs, the separate Torahs, the scrolls. It has obviously seating for the people who need to seat. In Orthodox synagogues, we divide between men and women. In Europe, there were many galleries. Also in India, there were examples of galleries. So, for example, if you went to Beth El Zadok's old building on 34th and Buckle, they actually had a women's upper level gallery there. But this has kind of fallen out of usage in America. In Orthodox synagogues, you might have to split right down the middle between men and women in some places. And liberal synagogues, Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist, there is no separation of men and women at all. And men and women perform the same functions. So it really depends on what movement of Judaism, what ethnic groups they're coming from. But there are some, there's an ark there that holds the Torah. There's a lectern, a stand that they can put the Torah on that they can read from, and it's facing east. Those are basic, basic ingredients of most synagogues.
Thank you. Very good.
Have any more questions?
Well, I've got a bunch, but I'm surprised and delighted that you have this picture. I saw it in 1979. It's a vacant building. And I know that maybe within 5 years it was demolished. That was on 2nd Street in Columbus. And do you know? I don't see here when was that built?
That was built. Even 1871.
And then it became a house, a residence.
Correct. Yes.
Because it looks residential.
A lot of synagogues, by the way, are businesses, homes, and in Alsace-Lorraine, by the way, it was very common for Jews to pray at home instead of synagogues. When I was talking about small town Jewish life, it wasn't uncommon for Jews to simply pray at home. So people ask, why did the Gimbel start a synagogue? Because, in Europe, the first thing you did wasn't start a synagogue. It was, first build up enough bandwidth in the community, and then the synagogue comes much later. and that's how it was in Europe. That's how it also was in America as well.
Rabbi Wise, I know, came to Indianapolis several times. One of them was the dedication of the Market Street Temple.
Right.
And then that was their first purpose-built temple. And then this one other mountain, which stood at 10th Delaware. He came from that.
That was one of his last times.
Yeah, he came that like 50 years later.
Right.
He's amazing. Now, did he start Reform Judaism while he was still in Germany?
So Reform Judaism started in Hamburg, or the Hamburg Temple, in 1818. When he came to Albany, New York, that was the Orthodox synagogue, but he started picking up on some of the Reform ideology. The first Reformed temple in America was actually before Isaac Wise in South Carolina. There was actually a Reformed congregation that formed in Charleston before Isaac Wise started to accept the Reform ideology. And even within the Reform movement, he was sort of a middle person. He was kind of a pragmatic person who would sort of try to be in the middle of any situation rather than on the right or left flanks of any situation, trying to be as pragmatic as he possibly can. He tried to be pragmatic on every issue that you can imagine, trying to bend around and twist into pretzel-like shapes, trying to convince people that he was reasonable, basically.
So he was being, as St. Paul said, be all things.
Exactly, right.
And I see a similarity of those the antebellum or Civil War era temples, like the one that you made us aware of in Lafayette and the old one in Fort Wayne and so on. Now, we know the name of that architect who designed the synagogue. Would you call it synagogue or temple because of the
You could, sometimes it's interchangeable. So about the verbiage of temple. So there's politics involved in it. So a temple is, the Reform movement wanted people to believe that the temple in Jerusalem no longer mattered, that the temple is wherever you hang your hat at. So your temple in Indianapolis is just as important as the temple in Jerusalem. So by calling it temple was actually a political move of saying we are loyal to your country 100%, and our temple is here, it's not in Jerusalem. Even that, so that was, but there were other people, because the name became so popular, calling it temple, there were even non-reformed congregations that called themselves temples later on. So it just became the, everything is a temple. But in certain situations, Orthodox synagogues wouldn't have called themselves a temple. They would only call themselves a synagogue, or a shul, or a kahal in Hebrew.
So the which is a great building, the one that you made us aware of in Lafayette. That architect, I was trying to find out was he a German Jew or was he a Gentile German? He has a German name.
I don't know. I never heard if he was Jewish or not.
And I couldn't figure out if he did a bunch of other ones.
I know that for a fact that in Madison, Wisconsin, there is a synagogue, and they're also in Milwaukee. There were synagogues that looked exactly the same architectural design, the same sides. And by the way, one in Madison, Wisconsin is still there. So it's still a synagogue. And in Berlin, I actually went to a synagogue built in the same architectural style that's still there. It still survived the war, one of the 5 synagogues that survived. So it was a very, very popular style. It was also really popular building railroad stations in architectural style too in Germany. So it wasn't synagogues. Right. It wasn't just a Jewish architectural style. No, it was just a popular 19th century architecture. A Rundbogenstil.
Round is
How many Rundbogenstil sorry, my terrible pronunciation. Buildings do you think we have in Indiana?
I don't know, but there's a church down the street, German congregation, that's Rundbogenstil.
Interesting.
Our city market, right across from the city council. And it's the same architect that a German architect.
Interesting.
Also in Rundbogenstil.
So there's a synagogue mapping project that is coming. Mark your calendars for later in June. It's 3 years in the works. And so my predecessor, Wendy Soltz, Dr. Wendy Soltz, who's at Ball State University, she really went after the architectural part of it. So you get all the architectural questions answered through the mapping project. And what I've tried to tackle in the meantime is the questions of why these congregations formed, who the congregations were, who the rabbis were, and I decided to focus on this era because we have these wonderful newspapers that are all digitized, the Deborah and the American Israelite and the Occident, that are all there. So you can really get a feel for what it was like in the 19th century, all these different debates. What were the big issues, big issues that people were, were willing to knock each other out. Basically, what was really driving that and come to Indiana? What was getting them to build these communities? Those were the questions I wanted to answer. I think newspapers did that.
Could it be that the peddlers went where they needed to go for business and then
Sure. Yeah, like the way the peddlers worked was that they had their own territories. They would call them Medina. So they would have their own territories that they would work in, that the store they would say, this is your district, this is the area you're working in, and they wouldn't clash with each other that way. So there weren't disputes between the different peddlers. But what would happen is that the peddler in a chain migration style would find their closest relative and say, hey, you want to get married, or hey, cousin, or this so and so relative want to come over to America. And they would bring that relative over to America. So you see this clear, like, going from being a peddler to opening up the store to a kind of chain migration of bringing other people over. And this is true of so many different ethnic groups. This isn't just, Jews. There were so many other ethnic groups that would get their start this way in America.
One of the great department stores in Indianapolis, commercial history, was the William H. Block and Company. And he started out in New York State as a peddler with a pack on his back. Then he comes out to Indianapolis and establishes a store. And then he has, his descendants are running the, I'll call it, the second best department store in the city, second to LSA or something.
Yeah.
He was smart. He built his store, beautiful store, right opposite the front door of the interurban station. So shoppers could come into Indianapolis throughout central Indiana or beyond. The first thing they see is Williams Block's department store. And that building's still standing. It's TJ Maxx is on the first floor and apartments are above.
And then you have tailors. So you have all there's a wonderful book about the Civil War, Jews in the Civil War, and Indianapolis was so important to manufacturing Civil War uniforms. And there were so many Jews, and like the Glazer family was really involved in that, an early Jewish family there in Indianapolis, and Cincinnati as well. So manufacturing a lot of the Union uniforms came right from Indianapolis with these Jewish families there. That's really how they just took off after that. You can see in the 1870s, the community became very successful, very financially stable, and to a point where they felt like they were totally integrated in society. So the next chapter, the other immigrants who came after them, they felt like, oh no, how are we going to integrate these others who people might not, they don't speak a language that other people understand. Like they spoke German. None of the non-Jews spoke Yiddish. So how are they going to integrate this community? So for many, many years, this community, the German-speaking Jewish community, really ran community trust and really sort of set the tempo for the community. You could say really up until the 1920s, you could say, well in the 20s and 30s, even after other Jewish communities started to sort of push the reins and say onto the other immigrant groups. In Indianapolis, they kind of hung on a little longer because they were a little bit bigger Jewish, German-speaking Jewish community. There wasn't a huge immigration in the early 20th century compared to other cities like Cleveland or Detroit or Chicago. So they still kind of maintain these different positions within the Jewish Federation, which was created in 1904, 1905 to help integrate immigrants come into Indianapolis. Anybody else have any other questions about synagogue?
Yeah, not so much a question, but I'm from a rural area in Germany. We have a lot of former Jewish communities. But of course, emancipation, people were able to leave the rural areas and go to the cities, but many moved directly to America. And there's a cemetery that was sponsored by a Jewish man who became very successful in Chicago. They have his name on it, they spell Chicago. I think actually not very misspell Chicago. I do it all. It's kind of really interesting. And so they have still in the rural Germany, California. And there was just a little bit of trades that Jewish people were involved, and they're blacksmiths and tailors, of course, you mentioned that, woodworkers and all kinds of stuff. That was kind of what you can normally not our kind of trades that I was thinking about that Jewish people would be involved.
Cattle rustling. Jews were very involved in cattle in Germany.
Yeah, and that was, some of them were very successful with that, and that sometimes created this animosity where you have people buying animals.
And hops. Jews had a very big,
And wine.
and wine, yeah.
It's the Valentine's. So it's a kind of a really neat history, so thank you for sharing some of it.
As it relates to Indiana. You know, and it's interesting, you know, I have people who ask me questions of people that they think are Jewish but aren't really Jewish, who might come from a German community, you know, people. And you know, it's so interesting because of the kind of company they kept. They had so many different Jews in their own friendship circle that people thought that they were Jewish, but they weren't. So you just want to double check. I get those questions a lot. You know, and if you think about this institution here, there were only really two different clubs in Minneapolis that accepted Jews in the 19th century. The Columbia Club and here. And that was it. You couldn't join any other clubs. This is it. And so having that openness towards having Jews belong to the Das Deutsche Haus is so important for their integration and like they're part of the community. So that's so important. And you know, the Bamberger family, they really believed in continuing German education in the city. They really advocated for that. And even when people, even non-Jewish German speakers were like, you know, just assimilate, you know, who needs German anymore? So some of the big advocates of the German language themselves were Jews in the late 19th century, such as the Bamberger family. So thank you so much. If you have any other questions, you know, feel free to email me. If you need my card, just let me know. And I'm so happy to do this for you today. So happy.
Thank you.
Putting up the echo in this.
I don't know where the
I don't know how, but I disarmed your Zoom audio.
yeah.
I turned off your speaker. I turned everything down, so I don't know where the sound is coming from.
That's weird.
Well, with the echo, I got to hear it twice.
That's true.